So far, we've talked about bones, joints, movement, and muscles, but we can't neglect the nervous system that is at the root of all muscle movements, whether smooth, cardiac, or skeletal muscle. Muscles don't contract without first receiving a message from the nervous system. These signals from nerve cells, called neurons, have both electrical and chemical components. You probably know that electrical currents are generated within the human body. That's the principle behind diagnostic procedures like electrocardiography or electromyography. These currents are generated by the flow and differences in chemical ion concentrations, similar to how current is conducted in a battery. Ions are charged compounds within body fluids and body cells. Other chemicals, called neurotransmitters, can convey the message between one nerve cell and another, or between a neuron and a muscle. And while how all this works is very interesting, much of it takes place at the microscopic level, so it's outside the purview of gross anatomy, which focuses on the macroscopic. The anatomy of the nervous system is primarily divided into two main components: the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, often abbreviated as the CNS, consists of two and only two organs, the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system, or PNS, on the other hand, is made up of all other nerve tissue. This could be summarized as the body's nerves and structures called ganglia. Let's unpack that a bit more. You know, the brain is a mass of neural tissue housed inside the cranial cavity of the skull. The spinal cord is connected to the brain and housed within the vertebral column, the bones and structures that make up the spine. So the skull and vertebrae protect and safeguard the two organs of the central nervous system. But each of those CNS organs has nerves extending off of it that exit the cranium or leave the spine to form the peripheral nervous system. The nerves attached to the brain are called cranial nerves, and the nerves extending from the spinal cord are known as spinal nerves. The other component of the peripheral nervous system, the ganglia, are limited areas where the nuclei of some nerve cells are found outside the central nervous system. That will make more sense if we go over a little information about nerve cells called neurons. Most neurons have essentially three parts. First, a receiving end that typically has structures called dendrites that bring messages into the cell. Secondly, a region called the cell body that contains the nucleus of the neuron. Third, an extension that is the transmitting end of the nerve cell, called an axon, or sometimes called a nerve fiber. These axons release chemicals called neurotransmitters. And when we talk about neuromuscular relationships, those neurotransmitters can either stimulate or inhibit the next cell or cells in the line, which in the pathways we're talking about in this course would be a group of skeletal muscle cells. The cranial and spinal nerves are bundles of these axons wrapped in connective tissue and traveling together outside the central nervous system. And while most neuron cell bodies are within the brain and spinal cord, there are a few isolated regions outside the central nervous system where cell bodies cluster in areas called ganglia. These nerves and ganglia together make up the peripheral nervous system. So that's a concise summary of the two major anatomical subdivisions of the nervous system, the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. We should also address something about the physiological subdivisions of the nervous system. One subdivision is referred to as the somatic nervous system, abbreviated SNS. It controls voluntary skeletal muscles and conveys most of our conscious sensations to the brain. The other physiological subdivision is the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. That controls involuntary cardiac and smooth muscle, as well as many glands of the body. Our focus will be on the somatic nervous system. In terms of functionality, much of the somatic nervous system can be divided into sensory pathways and motor pathways. Sensory pathways bring information into the central nervous system from the periphery, like from sensory receptors in our skin, from our joints and muscles, as well as from other internal organs. Sensory pathways are the input to the central nervous system and are also known as afferent pathways. Motor pathways, on the other hand, carry commands from the central nervous system, either from the brain or spinal cord, and these commands are passed to nerves of the peripheral nervous system. If we're talking about neuromuscular relationships, these motor nerves will either stimulate the skeletal muscle to contract or may inhibit the muscle, telling it to relax. These outgoing motor signals are also known as efferent pathways. The motor neurons themselves can be called efferent neurons, and sensory neurons are also known as afferent neurons. A memory trick is to consider the word same. The SA in same helps us remember that sensory means afferent, and the ME in the word same helps remind us that motor is efferent. So let's give an example. In order for you to feel something with your hands, receptors in the skin are stimulated by touch and pass a signal along an afferent peripheral neuron within a spinal nerve connected to the spinal cord. There, a second neuron in the pathway will carry that message up the spinal cord in areas called ascending tracts. These will eventually lead to brain regions where we perceive that sensation. In fact, we don't feel in our hands. It's more accurate to say that we feel with our hands, but we feel in our brain. And for you to move your hand consciously, areas of your brain send messages down descending tracts of the spinal cord and out one or more spinal nerves, full of axons of efferent neurons. Then they lead to the muscles that control your hand. Remember that cranial and spinal nerves are bundles of axons traveling together outside the central nervous system. Most cranial nerves usually relate to sensory input from the head, including our special senses, and motor control to the head and neck, while most spinal nerves carry sensations from the trunk and limbs and motor control to the trunk and limbs. The brain initiates our voluntary movements and even generates defined and coordinated pathways for our collective actions that some call muscle memory. The memory isn't in our muscles. The memory is a coordinated series of neural pathways that we store in our brain. These allow us to remember and perform activities like how to steer the car, dance the twist, pitch a baseball, or do downward dog in yoga once we've learned it. So what about reflex activity, like pulling your hand away from a hot stove before you even feel it in your brain? Reflex activity uses many of the same neurons and the same nerves, but operates on shorter pathways. Those that control reflexes of the upper limb are coordinated in the spinal cord to cause unplanned movement before we even realize it. That doesn't make these muscles involuntary. They are still voluntary skeletal muscles. It's just a protective mechanism of the body that utilizes a shorter, quicker, and largely involuntary pathway to those muscles. Remember that we have receptors in our skeletal muscles, in our tendons, and in our joints that also act reflexively. These aid our balance during coordinated muscle activities like running, bowling, dancing, and yoga. And this is very intriguing to think about. With so many different structures in these pathways, and with both electrical and chemical signals involved, there are many opportunities for disease, trauma, or other pathologies to affect the nervous system's control over muscles. Damaged brain regions from a stroke can render voluntary movements impossible, depending on the body part or the region that area of the brain controls. But if the spinal cord is not damaged, reflexive movements of those regions may still take place. The same is true of sensation from afferent pathways. A massive stroke can be devastating, but small areas of brain damage from a stroke can result in only a limited body region being affected. For example, my mom had a mini stroke during or following surgery, and the result was only a numb spot on her thumb and another one on her face. Wow, was she lucky. Damage to the spinal cord, such as from a fracture or a gunshot wound, could block transmission of voluntary motor pathways that originate in the brain and prevent them from reaching the peripheral nerves. Injuries to the spinal nerves themselves, like from a deep wound on a limb, can block the signals between the spinal cord and the skeletal muscle tissue. Or damage to the muscle itself can cause it to be unresponsive to signals from the nervous system. All complex pathways like this have many levels at which pathology or injury can occur. Now, given this isn't a neuroscience course, I'll try to confine our discussion of the nervous system to what we most need to understand the control of our skeletal muscles. Since the nerves of the peripheral nervous system most directly stimulate the muscles, let's go into more detail there. Remember, peripheral nerves extend from the two components of the CNS. Cranial nerves come off of the brain and spinal nerves come off of the spinal cord. We'll consider both of these types in this course, depending on the body region being discussed. This is because, in general, cranial nerves govern functions in the head and neck, while spinal nerves control skeletal muscles and receive sensations from the trunk and limbs. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves that come directly off the brain and exit the cranial cavity by various holes in the skull, generally called foramina. But as we saw in the lesson on the skeletal system, some of these passageways are more tube-like and are called canals, while others are more slit-like and called fissures. Regardless, a few of the cranial nerve pairs are entirely sensory in their function, such as those that relay the special senses of sight and hearing. Some other cranial nerves are entirely motor, meaning their sole function is to control muscle, whether skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or a combination of those. And still other cranial nerves are both sensory and motor and cover a myriad of functions, most of which are in the head and neck. But 9 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves govern some of our voluntary skeletal muscles, and all of those muscles are wholly or partly in the head or neck. So we'll learn a little more about some of those 9 when we cover muscles of the head and neck. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come directly off the spinal cord. They exit the vertebral column by openings formed between the vertebrae, where they're stacked on each other. Because these holes form between adjacent vertebrae, they're known as intervertebral foramina. As we'll see in the next lesson, there are 24 vertebrae, plus a sacrum and coccyx, sometimes called the tailbone, and spinal nerves also exit from those. The net result is 31 pairs of spinal nerves, which share their naming with their respective vertebrae. There are 8 pairs of cervical nerves in the neck region, 12 pairs of thoracic nerves in the area of the rib cage, 5 pairs of lumbar nerves in the low back, 5 pairs of sacral nerves that exit holes in the sacrum, and 1 pair of coccygeal nerves that exit between the sacrum and coccyx. Again, I know we haven't covered all of that yet, but we will in the next lesson. All 31 of these pairs of spinal nerves are considered mixed, relaying both sensory and motor information. Now, if you were to take a graduate level anatomy course, you would learn that there is one exception to that pattern, but we'll focus here on the generalities. Now, let's take a look at how these spinal nerves are formed. Starting at the spinal cord, each spinal nerve offshoot comes from the convergence of an anterior or ventral root with a posterior or dorsal root. For our purposes, I typically like to call these anterior and posterior roots, but referring to them as ventral and dorsal roots is also perfectly acceptable and common. Now, each anterior root is entirely motor, meaning that all of the neural pathways in it are outgoing efferent pathways from the CNS, such as to skeletal muscle or smooth muscle. Each posterior root is entirely sensory, in that all of the neurons in this structure are carrying incoming sensory afferent information from receptors in the periphery, like touch receptors in the skin or proprioception monitors in the muscles or joints that help us balance. Now, when these two roots come together, they form what we call a spinal nerve, which by definition is considered a mixed nerve, both sensory and motor in nature. This convergence of the anterior and posterior roots happens just before the resulting spinal nerve exits the intervertebral foramen. Then, almost immediately, each of the spinal nerves divides into a pair of distributional branches known as rami. The singular form is ramus. The larger of the pair is called the ventral ramus, and the smaller of the pair is known as the dorsal ramus of that given spinal nerve. While you could also call these anterior and posterior, respectively, to avoid confusion, I like to use anterior and posterior for the roots of a spinal nerve, while using ventral and dorsal for the spinal nerve's rami. Students have enough trouble differentiating roots and rami in my experience. So just to clarify, the two roots of a spinal nerve are functionally distinct, either sensory or motor. They extend out from the spinal cord and merge to form a spinal nerve just before it exits the intervertebral foramen. That spinal nerve is then mixed in function. It carries motor components from its anterior root and sensory components to its posterior root. Once this spinal nerve exits between adjacent vertebrae, it shortly divides into distributional branches called rami, which stay mixed, carrying both efferent and afferent neurons. Now let's look at the functions of the rami that extend from a typical spinal nerve. The easiest one to take a look at first is the dorsal ramus. The dorsal rami of spinal nerves supply what we call the true back muscles, those muscles whose job it is to support and move the spine. Calling them true back muscles differentiates them from other muscles that you may have heard of, like some of the rotator cuff muscles or the latissimus dorsi, that are located on the back to gain their leverage, but are really acting on an upper limb. We'll cover the muscles of the back later and learn that while some are really upper limb muscles, others are respiratory muscles, and only the deeper ones are true back muscles supplied by dorsal rami and acting on the spine itself. So the motor axons or motor fibers that start in the spinal cord travel out the anterior root, become part of a mixed spinal nerve, and then, if they're headed to the true back muscles that operate the spine, they'll travel through the dorsal ramus of the spinal nerve. True back muscles are the motor job of a dorsal ramus. The sensory job of a spinal nerve's dorsal ramus is to relay sensations from the skin of the middle third of the back. Now, the term middle third might sound odd, but consider taking the back and longitudinally dividing it into thirds. That central third is the approximate region of skin governed by the dorsal rami. So if someone taps you right in the middle of your back, that sensation is traveling into your central nervous system by passing through a dorsal ramus, then into a spinal nerve, and then, since touch is a sensory function, passing into the spinal cord by a posterior route before passing up ascending tracts until you finally perceive that tap on the back in your brain. When you think of it, it's pretty amazing that all that takes only fractions of a second. And each spinal nerve is responsible for sensation from a given patch of skin known as a dermatome. What I say to my physical therapy and physician assistant students is that their patient's skin is really a window that allows for a glimpse into their patient's nervous system. The territory from the back of your head down to a taper that ends at the so-called natal cleft, which is the technical term for the butt crack, though it goes by other names, that is the sensory turf that belongs to the dorsal rami of the spinal nerves. As you can see from the dermatome map, as we move from that middle third out to the more lateral aspects of the back, we begin to run into the ventral ramus territory of that same spinal nerve. So let's talk about the roles of ventral rami. Now, ventral rami are a bit more complicated, so I often tell my students to memorize the functions of dorsal rami first. They relay the sensations from the skin down the middle of the back and carry the motor control over the true back muscles. Then assign all other functions attributed to spinal nerves to the ventral rami. But remember, cranial nerves govern most of the sensory and motor functions in the head and neck. So if dorsal rami are concerned with the skin down the middle third of the back and the back muscles that actually operate the spine, then the ventral rami are concerned with everything else that isn't supplied by a cranial nerve. Now let's expand on that everything else governed by ventral rami of spinal nerves using a quick summary. In terms of their sensory function, ventral rami transmit the sensations for all other skin below the head. This means the skin of the lateral 2/3 of the back, the entire skin of the anterior and lateral trunk, as well as 100% of the skin of the upper and lower limbs, whether that skin's on the front of the limb or the back of the limb, but not the skin of the face. Sensations from there travel by a cranial nerve. That's the extensive sensory or afferent function of a ventral ramus of a spinal nerve. So what about its motor function? Again, this is part of the everything else that's not supplied by a cranial nerve and not supplied by a dorsal ramus. So ventral rami of spinal nerves control the motor functions of all muscles of the trunk and all muscles of the limbs, whether anterior or posterior, other than the true back muscles. This includes the muscles of the chest, abdominal wall, pelvis, pelvic floor, all the muscles that are within the limbs, and all the muscles that control upper or lower limb movement. Some of these, like the latissimus dorsi, happen to live on the back in order to gain leverage. Then they cross, say, the shoulder joint and move the upper limb. Obviously, ventral rami are much more complex than dorsal rami in terms of their areas of service. There's one more thing we ought to cover that's related to ventral rami. They have essentially two main fates, or take two main forms. First, in the thorax, the ventral rami assume a relatively simple pattern by hugging a rib as it proceeds around the chest wall. These ventral rami are called intercostal nerves. These intercostal nerves supply the muscles that move the rib cage and those of the anterolateral abdominal wall. These intercostal nerves also receive sensations from the dermatomes of the lateral and anterior trunk. So the ventral rami of thoracic nerves can synonymously be called intercostal nerves because they travel between ribs. The second fate or pattern that a ventral ramus can assume is to become part of what's called a nerve plexus. The term plexus is Latin for braid or plate, and the ventral rami of spinal nerves, other than those in the thorax, braid together into what's called a plexus. You may have heard of the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, or the sacral plexus. These plexuses are braids of ventral rami that overlap to supply a given body region. For example, as we'll see, the brachial plexus is a braid of ventral rami that come together to supply the skin and muscles of the upper limb. The lumbar and sacral plexuses are groups of ventral rami that braid together and supply the skin and muscles of the lower limbs. Now, these nerve plexuses are entirely composed of ventral rami, originating from either superior to or inferior to the intercostal nerves that assume that simple rib hugging pattern. No dorsal ramus has any role in any of those plexuses. Why? Because they supply the skin of the back and true back muscles, period. Now, just to review, let's try to put all this together with a couple of examples. First, let's say I reach out and push an elevator button. What are the motor pathways that allow me to push that elevator button using the muscles in my upper limb? That conscious decision begins in the motor portion of my cerebral cortex, reaches and travels down descending tracts of the spinal cord, and then would these messages pass out of an anterior root or a posterior root of a spinal nerve? Remember, the anterior root is the motor root. Then that message travels in a mixed spinal nerve, which exits an intervertebral foramen, and then uses the ventral ramus to reach my brachial plexus, since only ventral rami can become part of a plexus. From there, the pathway will pass along nerves in my upper limb and control the muscles that let me push the elevator button. Now that's being very simplistic because numerous muscles would be necessary for me to flex at the shoulder, extend at the elbow, extend my wrist and digits, and push that elevator button. So in reality, several spinal nerves that all braid together in the brachial plexus would be involved, but hopefully you get the idea. Now, how about the sensation that will allow me to feel that I've pushed the elevator button? Receptors in my fingers send a signal through my hand using which kind of nerve cell? One that is sensory or one that's motor? If you said sensory, that's correct. This sensation travels along nerves that become part of the brachial plexus of the upper limb, and from there travels along the ventral ramus of a specific spinal nerve, since only ventral rami make up the nerve plexuses that govern the limbs. And I happen to know that from the tip of my finger, the electrical activity will most likely wind up in the 7th cervical nerve. But that's assuming I'm part of the 70% club that has the cutaneous distribution from my index finger in that typical textbook pattern. Next, that pathway needs to travel to one of the roots of that spinal nerve. Since we're discussing sensation from the skin, will that pass through the anterior root or the posterior root? If you remember, the posterior root is the sensory root of a spinal nerve. From there, that sensation will travel up ascending tracts within my spinal cord until it reaches the sensory portion of my brain's cerebral cortex, where I will actually feel the touch of the elevator button on my skin. And what's more, some of you may know that the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body and vice versa. So when we talk about sensation from my right finger, it is perceived by the left side of my brain. And the decision to push that button with my right finger began on the left side of my brain. There's a part of the brainstem where these messages cross over to the opposite side of the body. That's the reason a person who has a major stroke on the left side of his brain will lose control of right side body muscles and will also not be able to sense things on the right side. Now, there was a lot of content packed into this lesson. So let me outline the key points we will use in our future discussions of muscles and movement. Of course, the brain is the site of initiation for voluntary control over skeletal muscle. Specific regions within the brain's surface, called the cerebral cortex, control particular parts of the body. Signals sent from the brain to muscles of the neck, trunk, and limbs travel to skeletal muscle groups in those regions by passing inferiorly down the spinal cord and then out of the anterior roots, the motor roots of spinal nerves. From there, those motor pathways will travel to their target muscles using either the ventral ramus or dorsal ramus of that spinal nerve, depending on precisely where in the body those target muscles are located. If the skeletal muscles are in the head and neck, they may go straight from the brain out of a cranial nerve to reach their target, and the spinal cord won't be involved. As we now turn from these overarching principles to the next block of lessons, we'll get specific about the bones and joints of the axial skeleton and the muscles that move them. We'll also study more about the cranial and spinal nerves that control that movement, whether movements are reflexive, as when moving your hand away from a hot stove, or are highly coordinated, like those of a trained ballet dancer. They do not occur without being stimulated by the nervous system.